Hello, everybody. It's me, Fee, or Fiona Timms, otherwise known as White Zulu, author of my autobiography of the same name. And I welcome you all to another chapter of my book. I do hope you're all enjoying my life story, and I must thank all of you for being such dedicated subscribers, especially those who have written such complimentary comments below my videos. They are much appreciated. I would like to point out that the previous South African flag hanging on the wall behind me is not a political statement. It is simply a piece of history in the background of my first 50 years of my life, being born and growing up in my beloved mother country, South Africa. My autobiography, White Zulu, is not a political commentary, and frankly describes my experiences of growing up with the Zulu tribe as my family. That flag is simply a piece of cloth signifying the history of South Africa. It was originally used by the Union of South Africa from 1928 to 1961, and later the Republic of South Africa until 1994. Hello, everybody. It's me, Vicky, the White Zulu, all my nicknames. I seem to accumulate them like a rolling moss. Rolling moss gather. No, rolling stone gathers moss, but this one gathers plenty of moss. Anyway, you know who I am. And if I left you last when we were having a braai at the top of the farm, and Fred was still trying to corner my father and ask him for my hand in marriage, which was absolutely considered, it had to be done. There was no way of getting out of it. My older sisters had to do it, or their potential husbands, and he was no exception. Fred and I walked ahead of my parents, while Nicolette and Robin and their boys trailed far behind, still bewitched by the tranquility and reluctant to gather up rugs and greasy braai grid. We all carried bits of picnic paraphernalia as we made our way slowly down the newly created shoreline of this lake my father was creating. Fred stopped ostensibly to admire Dad's burgeoning lake, the project that he'd been working on, planning for several years, and which was finally coming to fruition this spring. Without any warning, not even a glance in my direction, Fred lobbed the empty lager can he'd been carrying into the pristine water, where it floated some distance away, an insult bobbing on wavelets whipped up by a warm breeze. My parents' jaws dropped, as did mine, and we were speechless for a moment. Fred, what are you doing? We all three exclaimed simultaneously, shocked by this aberration of behaviour. You little lout, do you do this on your own lochs in Scotland? Demanded my father, still in disbelief at this outrage. Without a word, Fred pulled out his trout rod from its case, quickly assembled it, and cast the line out just once. His fly landed directly on the sinking tin. The hook caught on the small opening punched into the lid. This was long before ring tabs, and stuck fast. He slowly and deliberately reeled the offending can back to shore and stepped forward to pick it up. Good cast, said Dad in admiration. He never praised anybody, especially not to their faces. Thoroughly impressed now, and realizing how much skill Fred had demonstrated. It wasn't like my future husband to be a show-off, far from it, but apparently he had a streak of mischief about him. And later I said, "Oh boy, you were pushing your luck there. I don't know how you got away with that. I thought my folks were about to have you thrown off the property." He just chuckled. Their faces were a picture. It had a better effect than even I intended, he said with quiet triumph. Before supper, I decided to lend a hand in the proceedings and tried to call my father out of the sitting room on some sort of pretext. But once he was lodged in his armchair, there was no budging him. Sunday morning came and went, and we were sitting in the sun on the front veranda, about to have pre-lunch drinks when, as the sitting room carriage clock struck 12, Dad got up and walked into the house to get a bottle of gin from his safe in the office. On my quick and subtle prompt, as I knew exactly where Dad was headed, his routine had never varied as long as I'd been alive. Fred stood up and, moving casually at first, walked quickly up the steps, following my father into the house. They were gone for a while when I heard Dad laughing. It sounded like pleased laughter, and when they came back, he was beaming and carrying a bottle of champagne. Fred walked over to the cane armchair where I was seated, pulled the little blue velvet box out of his pocket, and dropping carefully to one knee on the hard, ridged, dark tiles, opened the box and offered me the diamond and sapphire ring, which lay sparkling on the satin lining. "Will you marry me?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. Fred looked enormously relieved, and everybody in the family jumped to their feet to congratulate us. "I thought he'd never pluck up the courage to ask me," said Dad, as Robin poured us all a glass of champagne. "He followed me all over the farm for the entire weekend. I nearly said to him a couple of times, 'Is there something you want to ask?' John did the exact same thing to me when he wanted to marry Diana, and it drove me nearly mad." We drove back to Durban that afternoon, elated and deliriously happy, making exciting plans for our future, to settle back into our familiar, cozy routine in the flat overlooking the bay. "Darling, are you sure you know what you're doing?" she pleaded. Bar's reaction when Fred rang her at home to tell her that we'd just got engaged didn't come as too much of a surprise. This was his mother. She tried really hard to dissuade me from coming back at all, Fred had remarked when he'd returned to Durban after the few weeks' holiday with his parents at Glencruiton Castle in Scotland. I think she suspected then that he had a girlfriend back in Durban, and she wasn't too keen on that idea. She had better prospects in mind for her beloved son and heir to the massive baronial house and thousands of acres of land in the West Highlands that formed Glencruiton. Fred had told me that Princess Margaret was a regular visitor to the house to attend various events like hunt balls and pheasant shoots. Bar even kept PMs, as they called her, jeep in a garage there so that Her Royal Highness could fly in by helicopter and be able to drive her own vehicle around the estate. One of my prospective mother-in-law's aunts was lady-in-waiting to the Queen Mother, and those were the circles in which she'd have preferred her oldest son to move. The Mackay Jameses were county folk and held a certain standing in Argyllshire. A rancher's daughter from Natal Midlands, was not her idea of a suitable prospective daughter-in-law. The farmer thing was bad enough, but a colonial would be the last straw. Bar was christened Rosemary Mackay, but none of that family was called by their original names. They all had nicknames, as I was to find out later. She married a Peter James, Bob, to all his family and friends. And because she had inherited Glen Cruton from her father, Alexander Mackay, she decided to keep her maiden surname and tack the James on to give it an upper-class double-barreled tone. Of course we can't possibly come all that way to a wedding, she said on the phone. Fred relayed this information to me and we looked at one another, both shrugged simultaneously and said, "Fine. Let's go ahead and have our wedding anyway, at New Forest," I suggested, and Fred agreed. My parents adored him, and not just because he'd been educated at Eton and had been to Cambridge, my father's old university. My entire family loved his gentle, shy nature and his deliciously wry sense of humour. He had this endearing British manner of self-deprecation, laughing with us, and loved living in South Africa, especially the climate. We spent practically every weekend of that year up at the farm because trout fishing was his passion, and he enjoyed walking over the lush green hills with us. I tried to persuade him to come riding with me, but he wasn't keen after his experience of fox hunting and preferred to give horses a wide berth. As we put our glasses down after toasting our engagement, Mum sprang into action, grabbing lists from her drawer in the big desk in the office. The first decision was the wedding date. It's correct to wait 3 months after announcing your engagement, so that'll make it late spring. The weather and the roads will be getting very wet by then, so I'd like to have it earlier. But then it looks wrong. A wedding too soon after the engagement isn't right. Better to take a chance with the weather than look as if we're hurrying the whole thing. She put on her reading glasses and peered at the stock owner's calendar hanging from a nail on the office wall just above the hand crank telephone. Yes, it'll have to be mid-October. The 21st is a Saturday. That'll have to do. Tapping her teeth with the capped end of her ballpoint pen, she gazed out of the office window at Jormela, who was on his hands and knees with a pair of old sheep shears edging the springy kikuyu grass that tufted off the far edge of the back lawn. He worked at a snail's pace as he was getting very old now. Every now and again he took a rest, lying on his side, his hoary old head propped up on his left hand, as he swiped ineffectually at the ever-attendant flies with the hand that held the rusty shears. His grizzled curls, thinning at the top now, were hidden under a tattered old khaki hat one of Ngiti's cast-offs by the look of it. Jomela had become slightly senile, although he couldn't have been more than 60, which is considered a great and venerable age among Zulus. He was due to be pensioned off soon, to live out the remainder of his days back in Mpendla, where he could sit in the sun all day, with his back against his sun-warmed hut, his daughters and grandchildren bringing him food and amacheu. A damn nice way to end one's days, Dad always remarked, about all his old retainers' impending pensions. I envy the old bugger. I wouldn't mind that kind of life when I'm old. Then he sighed. But I suppose I'm going to have to go on farming until I drop, with you lot still hanging around my neck. This was said with some rancour every time he heard about anybody's retirement. None of us felt brave enough to point out that Dad had spent his entire life in retirement already, with a white manager to deal with day-to-day farming and a full-time accountant and lawyer to cope with whatever else needed doing. Now we need to get the announcement into the papers, said Mum. The Mercury and the Natal Witness, I think. Nobody we know reads the Daily News. Mum wrinkled her nose. So I won't bother with that. She had lists in front of her that she'd made for Diana's wedding 2 years earlier. Nicolette's wedding had taken place in Johannesburg, not on the farm, and it had been a huge risk holding Diana's on the farm. The road is too dreadful. We can't ask people to hammer their cars over those ruts, and if it's wet, everybody will get stuck, Mum had lamented. But as it happened, Diana had pronounced her engagement at the right time of year, so her wedding took place in May, early winter, and the dry season, before the district road deteriorated too much. A little bit of red dust on bride and guests was of no real consequence. You'll have to put the announcements in, she said to me. It's too far for me to drive to Maritzburg just for that, and they won't accept it over the phone. Now, the dress. She jumped to her feet and disappeared into their bedroom. After a while, she came back carrying the beautiful, long, white and tastefully lace-adorned dress that Nicolette had worn at her wedding. Diana had to wear it too, in spite of the fact that there'd been a large yellowish stain on the front, where somebody had spilt some champagne the first time it had been worn. We'll just rub some talc into the mark. Nobody'll see it, she'd snapped, when Diana complained. This is where Mum was so peculiar. She'd insist that everything had to be perfect. The wedding, the garden, the day, especially the weather, had to be all at its absolute best and in excellent taste. She'd spend weeks agonizing over the exact colour of the marquee, as well as that of the damask and tablecloths and napkins. God help those who misguidedly called them serviettes. But she wouldn't dream of buying new wedding dresses for her daughters, let alone allowing them to choose their own. It's a waste of money, she'd snap, and she certainly didn't trust our taste. She'd always chosen our clothes, be they passed on from English cousins, smart South African relatives, or made by her dressmaker. The first time I ever bought myself a new dress was when I'd received my first salary in my first job a couple of months back. Needless to say, I chose black, something we weren't allowed to wear. Young girls should never wear black, she'd say emphatically, and no one should wear black in the daytime unless they're going to a funeral. She had so many rules. Purple, mauve, lilac, and orange were taboo. Any bright colours are common, as are shiny material. Spangles, as she disparagingly called anything with the suggestion of glitter or sparkle, what I'm wearing today, on purpose. Spangles, with the suggestion of glitter or sparkle, and gold chain belts, which were all the rage then. Makes you look like a coolie Christmas. This was the worst insult she could inflict. Coolie is the derogatory South African name for Indians, mostly Hindu outcasts or untouchables, as they were known colloquially, who came out to Durban to cut the sugar cane in the mid-19th century. I put this bit in for my overseas readers, just to explain. Settled after serving out their indentured contracts and after many years of hard work growing fruit and vegetables on small holdings in the rich alluvial soil around the Natal and Zululand areas, used their astute business acumen and enterprising trading practices to develop booming and excitingly gaudy retail shops in Grey Street in Durban. That is all for the time being, and there's more to come next week. I would like to thank John Moslane for putting aside his Friday afternoons to help me produce these videos. Without him, I could not do this. I would also like to thank Sean van Vuren for his sterling work in uploading my videos to my YouTube channel, adding the photos, as well as managing my channel so professionally. If you would like to know more about my other works, I have written 5 books in all, and each one is autobiographical. Please visit my website at www.whitezulubook.com, where you will find a lot more information as well as plenty of photographs. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed my life story, and there is plenty more to come. A thumbnail photo will be attached each week, and thank you so much for all your support and all the very kind remarks you make in complimenting me on my work. I really appreciate it. Goodbye.